having grown up overseas shapes your idea of who you are. I had spent a life thinking I was an ambassador for my country, being told I was an ambassador for my country, and that how I behaved when I walked outside the gates of the base on which we lived, I was a representative of my country. I lived overseas 9 years. You internalize that at some point and really believe that people are paying attention, and I think actually they are, to how you interact with them, how you treat them, and that's how they think of us. So it's not just that's who I am, that's sort of, it also shapes my political sense about how it is we behave collectively as a country and also individually. And I think individually we seem to do basically all right, and collectively we're not doing so well. When the nuclear subs were docking in Yokosuka, I didn't live in Yokosuka, but there was a lot of protest about it. In Japan, you can understand why that would be so. We had lived down near Hiroshima when I was younger, and my mother would never let me go to the museum, but I'd been to the Sadako statue and a lot of the places that were less gruesome looking, but certainly as moving. So you could understand why the reaction to these subs would be what it is, but it also made it a very dangerous place. You did have a sense of how our power was viewed and how our use of power was viewed. And when our use of power seemed to not take into consideration the point of view of the other country or whatever, how angry people became at us. And maybe we did the only thing we could. Maybe it was taken into consideration. I was too young really to evaluate it at the time. But it made you think about whether or not we ought to be considering how we're doing things. My dad went to Vietnam, and that was a difficult experience for me. I was in the middle of a high school football game, cheerleader, and when he left, and of course I cried through the entire second half of a game that we lost, and everyone assumed that I was crying because we were losing, but I was crying because he went to Vietnam. And we also would go see soldiers. Some of the soldiers would come to Japan for treatment, and we would see them. I was a junior in high school. These boys looked like I did. They didn't look any older. I mean, they were a little bit older, but they didn't look any older than I did. It may be one of the things that you block a little bit, because I really only have like a couple of images standing beside the bed of a young, dark-haired boy who had just a sweet face, but basically was bandaged. The rest of him was bandaged up, and you'd like to sort of reach and touch him, but it didn't matter. I mean, everything was bandaged down to his hands. He had one leg that was elevated and gone in cheerleading uniforms to remind them of, that there were still American girls who wanted to talk to him. And he didn't move his head. I don't know whether he'd cut his eyes, but he didn't really move his head. And I felt impotent. You have this notion that you're going to come in and make people happy, as if seeing, some high school cheerleader is going to change what his life is going to look like in 10 minutes or 20 or 2 years. His life has changed. My only news sources. We had no television, no radio in English besides the Armed Forces Network, no newspapers besides the Stars and Stripes. I am not likely to be getting a point of view which suggests that I could think differently about it. One of the things, though, that did make me concerned, even at 16, is that over Thanksgiving, let me step back for a second, my father was always happy, positive about everything. They're bombing someplace, and my dad talks about brownies that my grandmother sent to me, and everything's fine out here. We did get bashed around by a tornado, and I lost my slacks, but everything's great. So when he would come back from Vietnam, or when we would talk to him on the phone periodically, in that crazy old way you used to talk on the phone where it would be a crackle and you'd have to wait and talk back, he would always be positive. So I got even a more positive image from him than I would get from the Stars and Stripes. But this young man came, and I honestly don't know why. I've asked my mother, but none of us really remember why this young man, whom we did not know, came and stayed with us for Thanksgiving. But he had obviously had some sort of a breakdown in Vietnam, and they wanted to get him away for a little bit. So he came and stayed with us, stayed in my brother's room, and then after Thanksgiving, he went back. We could see, he was a young man, a few years older than we were, but we could see how disturbed he was, and yet they were sending him back. Is there any doubts? There was a doubt. There was doubts about how we were doing it with that fellow. Because most of the other people I came in contact with were either cheerful like my dad, or people who were going home. But here was somebody who was going back to war, who clearly should not have been going back to war. We got a lot more information, I think, probably because I got the Stars and Stripes, and it was war all the time for us. And then I came back to the States and for the first time was confronted with whether this war was a good idea and concluded that it wasn't a good idea. But then I was very conflicted about the way the soldiers were treated. One of the things that happened after Kent State is the demonization of the National Guard. I mean, Governor Rhodes was demonized, and I think perhaps rightly, but that there was also the demonization of these young men who they didn't get the kind of guidance and instruction they needed. And I felt a kinship with, not necessarily with the National Guard there, but with the soldiers and sailors coming back. It was very hard for me. It's a tremendous relief for me, and I've really tried to bolster it in every opportunity that I have to celebrate the fact that we're not making that mistake this time, that we're not confusing the policy with the warriors. There's a fellow who's doing the moving for me today, PJ, who spent 38 months in Iraq, and he's through with the Army. He's out, and glad he's out. He's not against the war necessarily. He said he went to Biscuitville and asked if they had a special for military when he was back on a 2-week leave, and they said, no, we have specials for firemen and policemen, the ones who really serve. He wrote to Biscuitville and hasn't been back, and there's also some Chick-fil-A he won't go to for the same reason. And I said, even though this fellow's a Republican, I said, I want you to know that whenever I'm in an airport and there's some guy in uniform standing next to me at the bagel place or someplace, I always, can I buy your lunch? Always. Whether that's leftover guilt by the way that the people I marched with in Vietnam, or whether I just finally feel good that I can express this without any hesitation because the nation is finally there. I grew up at a really transformative time for women, I think. Graduated from college in 1967. Then I went to English graduate school and then law school in 1977. My first year that I was in actual practice was because I clerked for a judge, 1978, 1979, and I was in Nashville, Tennessee. I remember going to a bankruptcy hearing. I didn't practice bankruptcy law, but I went to a hearing to sort of listen with this senior partner. I sat in the back, and it seemed clear that one of the people who were maybe responsible was going to flee. We called our friend a travel agent, and they said yes, he was booked on a flight to leave. So he needed to be served. I stood outside the courthouse and waited for his town car to pull up so he could put his bags in to get out of town, and I walked up and served him. I sort of chatted with him the whole time, saying, oh, the buses here are so unreliable. Oh, that's not my bus, just yakking away. I'd been in the courtroom, but he had never thought of me as a lawyer. Wow. I sat at the depositions table sometime. Depositions be taken, and I wouldn't be taking them, but I'd be taking notes. Well, I take shorthand. Shorthand's really good at a table like that because they don't know what you think is important because they can't read what you're writing. The lawyer with whom I was with, the lawyer I was with, and the other lawyer, the other lead lawyer, got up to leave the room to have a conversation, leaving the junior lawyer, the fellow being deposed, and me. These two guys talked as if I was not there because they assumed I was, a piece of furniture. And I saw clients who you had to convince that you were competent. If you were a male, you didn't have to convince them that you were competent. And I felt that a real responsibility then. Didn't make me angry. Sometimes it was funny, actually. You got some advantages from it. I could serve this guy. I could listen in on this conversation. But what you felt is a responsibility to get it right because you were going to have to go through whatever you had to go through. But you were going to have to prove to a bunch of businessmen, almost entirely businessmen, that women could do this work. If you were angry, and defiant and demanding, they were going to continue to pull back and be resistant. But if you wanted to pave the way for my daughter, I was going to have to do it by proving my worth. That was the only way we're going to eliminate the prejudice. Even though I consider myself a feminist, I was never the feminist who was out marching and screaming. It was always my feeling that the best way for me to do this was to be the best lawyer in the room. If I was the best lawyer in the room, they'd start forgetting I was a woman. And maybe the next time a woman walked in the room, they wouldn't have the same response that they initially had to me. So it was sort of survival for me, but also because you just have this responsibility to the people who come after you.